Every morning for 37 years, Margaret Chen fastened the same silver brooch to her left lapel with the precision of a sacred ritual. The delicate piece bore an intricate design of two intertwined birds, their wings spread as if caught in eternal flight, surrounded by tiny pearls that caught the light like captured tears. To her colleagues at the public library, to her neighbors on Maple Street, to the countless strangers who passed her on the sidewalk, it was simply Margaret's brooch, a charming vintage piece that seemed to suit her quiet elegance. But what none of them knew, what Margaret carried in the silence of her heart for nearly 4 decades, was that this small silver ornament held within its curves and shadows the deepest love story of her life, a love so profound and so forbidden by the world she inhabited that it could only exist in the language of symbols, in the whispered poetry of memory, and in the daily ritual of pinning a secret to her chest each morning like a prayer. The story begins not with Margaret, but with a letter that arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, when the maple trees outside her small apartment had turned the color of old photographs, and the air carried the particular melancholy that comes with the changing of seasons. Margaret, now 73 and moving with the careful deliberation of someone who has learned to negotiate with time, stood in her kitchen reading words that would unravel a lifetime of careful silence. The letter was from a lawyer in San Francisco, informing her that someone named Elena Vasquez had passed away the previous month and had left specific instructions that Margaret Chen of Cedar Falls, Iowa, should be contacted regarding a personal matter of great importance. Elena Vasquez. Margaret's hands trembled as she read the name, the newspaper crackling like autumn leaves between her fingers. Elena. After all these years, after all the careful forgetting, after all the practiced normalcy, Elena had reached across the divide between life and death to touch her one final time. Margaret sank into her kitchen chair, the same chair where she had eaten breakfast alone for the past 15 years since her husband Robert had died, and she allowed herself to remember. The brooch on her chest seemed to grow heavier, as if the weight of secrets accumulated over decades was suddenly pressing against her ribs, demanding acknowledgement. She closed her eyes and let the memories wash over her like a tide that had been held back by an increasingly fragile dam. She was 26 again, standing in the employee break room of Mercy General Hospital in San Francisco, wearing her pristine white nurse's uniform and trying to invisible herself into the corner while the other nurses chattered about their weekend plans and their boyfriends and their dreams of marriage and children. It was 1976. And Margaret had just moved to California from Iowa, carrying with her the weight of her parents' expectations and the suffocating certainty that she would never quite fit into the life that had been mapped out for her since birth. Elena had walked into that break room like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her scrubs somehow managing to look elegant despite their utilitarian design. She was the new physical therapist, recently graduated from UC San Francisco, and when she smiled at Margaret across the crowded room, something fundamental shifted in the younger woman's understanding of the world. Elena's eyes were the color of coffee with cream, warm and inviting and impossibly alive, and when she asked Margaret if she'd like to grab lunch together, Margaret felt something she had never experienced before, a kind of recognition, as if she had been walking through her life with her eyes closed and had suddenly opened them to discover that colors existed she had never imagined. Their friendship began innocently enough, or at least as innocently as any friendship could begin, when one of the participants was discovering that everything she had been told about love and desire and the human heart was incomplete at best, actively harmful at worst. They ate lunch together in the hospital cafeteria, sharing stories about their childhoods, their dreams, their fears about being young women in a profession that demanded everything from them while giving back so little recognition. Elena had grown up in Los Angeles, the daughter of Mexican immigrants who had sacrificed everything to give their children opportunities they had never had. She spoke Spanish when she was excited or frustrated, her hands moving in graceful arcs as she painted pictures with words, and Margaret found herself mesmerized by the music of Elena's voice, by the way she could make even the most mundane hospital gossip sound like poetry. As the weeks turned into months, their friendship deepened into something that Margaret had no words for, something that existed in the spaces between the acceptable and the speakable. They began spending their days off together, exploring San Francisco's hidden corners, sharing books and music and dreams that they had never dared to voice to anyone else. Elena introduced Margaret to art galleries in the Mission District, to small cafes where they served coffee that tasted like nothing Margaret had ever experienced in Iowa, to bookstores where women gathered to discuss literature and politics and the possibility of lives that didn't revolve around the approval of men. Margaret introduced Elena to the quiet pleasure of long walks through Golden Gate Park, to museums where they could lose themselves in beauty for hours, to the simple joy of sitting in silence together while the fog rolled in from the ocean like a blessing. The transformation in Margaret was subtle but profound. Her colleagues at the hospital noticed that she seemed lighter somehow, that her smile came more easily, that she had begun wearing clothes that flattered her figure instead of hiding it. Her parents, during their weekly phone calls, remarked that she sounded happier than she had in years, and they began to pressure her more insistently about finding a nice young man to marry. The irony was not lost on Margaret. She was happier than she had ever been in her life, but the source of that happiness was so far outside the realm of her parents' understanding that she might as well have been living on another planet. The moment when their friendship crossed into something else happened on a rainy Thursday evening in February. They had been studying together in Elena's small apartment near the hospital, preparing for continuing education exams, when a power outage plunged the building into darkness. Elena lit candles throughout the apartment, transforming the ordinary space into something magical and intimate. They were sitting on the floor, leaning against Elena's couch, their textbooks forgotten, when Elena began talking about her childhood, about the way her grandmother used to tell her stories about love that transcended the boundaries that society tried to impose on the human heart. Margaret listened, transfixed, as Elena spoke about love as a force of nature, as something that couldn't be controlled or constrained or forced into shapes that didn't fit. When Elena finally fell silent, Margaret found herself speaking words she had never dared to think, let alone say aloud. She talked about the loneliness that had been her constant companion for as long as she could remember, about the way she had always felt like she was performing a role rather than living a life, about the terror and wonder of discovering that everything she had been taught about herself might be wrong. Elena listened without judgment, her eyes reflecting the candlelight like stars, and when Margaret finally ran out of words, Elena reached across the small space between them and took her hand. The touch was electric, a current that ran from Elena's fingers through Margaret's entire body, illuminating parts of herself she had kept hidden in darkness. They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped, not speaking, both of them understanding that they had crossed a threshold from which there would be no returning. When Elena finally leaned forward and kissed her, Margaret felt like she was coming home to a place she had never known existed. Their love affair unfolded in secret, conducted in the shadows and margins of their ordinary lives. They were careful, so careful, meeting in Elena's apartment or taking long drives to beaches where they could walk hand in hand without fear of being seen by anyone who might recognize them. They created a language of glances and touches that allowed them to communicate their feelings even in the sterile environment of the hospital, where they had to pretend to be nothing more than colleagues and friends. Margaret learned to read the subtle changes in Elena's expression, the way her eyes would soften when she looked at her across a crowded room, the way she would find excuses to brush against her hand when passing instruments during procedures. For 18 months, they lived in this parallel universe of stolen moments and secret tenderness. Margaret had never been happier, but the happiness was always tinged with the knowledge that their love existed in a world that had no place for it. In 1977, in the conservative corridors of Catholic Hospital in San Francisco, their relationship was not just forbidden, it was unthinkable. They both knew women who had lost their jobs, their families, their entire lives for loving someone of the same gender. The fear was constant, a low-level anxiety that colored even their most joyful moments together. The end came suddenly, as endings often do. Margaret's mother called on a Wednesday morning to tell her that her father had suffered a heart attack and was in the hospital in Cedar Falls. She needed to come home immediately. Margaret took a leave of absence from the hospital, thinking she would be gone for a few weeks at most, but when she arrived in Iowa, she discovered that her father's condition was far more serious than her mother had indicated. He lingered for 3 months, during which Margaret served as his primary caregiver, sleeping in a hospital chair beside his bed, managing his medications, and slowly watching the man who had raised her slip away piece by piece. During those 3 months, Margaret and Elena maintained their connection through letters, careful compositions that spoke of friendship and concern while encoding deeper messages of love and longing. Elena wrote about the fog rolling in from the bay, about the way the city felt empty without Margaret's presence, about how she was counting the days until Margaret could return. Margaret wrote about Iowa's endless skies, about the way her father's eyes still lit up when she entered his room, about how she dreamed of Elena's voice every night. But when Margaret's father finally died in late June, and she found herself responsible for caring for her mother, who had become fragile and dependent in her grief, the reality of her situation began to crystallize. Her mother needed her, not just for a few months, but for the foreseeable future. The family business, a small insurance agency that her father had built over decades, was foundering without his leadership. The community that had raised her was rallying around her, offering support and comfort and the kind of belonging that she had never experienced in San Francisco. And there was Robert Shun, a kind and gentle man who had been her father's accountant and who had always harbored quiet feelings for Margaret. Robert was everything her parents had wanted for her: stable, successful, respectful, and utterly devoted to her happiness. In the weeks following her father's funeral, as Margaret struggled with the weight of responsibility and grief, Robert appeared at her side like a lifeboat in a storm. He asked nothing of her except the opportunity to help, to ease her burden, to provide the kind of support that her mother needed and that Margaret felt incapable of giving alone. The decision to stay in Iowa and marry Robert was not made in a single moment, but accumulated over weeks of small choices and compromises. Each day that passed made it harder to imagine returning to San Francisco, harder to explain to Elena why she couldn't come back, harder to reconcile the life she wanted with the life that duty demanded. When she finally wrote to Elena to tell her that she was engaged to Robert, the letter was so stained with tears that she had to rewrite it twice before the words were legible. Elena's response arrived 2 weeks later, and Margaret carried it to the willow tree beside the pond where she had played as a child before she could bring herself to open it. Elena wrote that she understood, that she had always known their love existed in borrowed time, that she would rather see Margaret safe and cared for than struggling alone against a world that wasn't ready for the truth of who they were. But enclosed with the letter was a small jewelry box, and inside the box was the silver brooch with the 2 intertwined birds. Elena had found it in an antique shop in the Mission District, she wrote, and the moment she saw it, she knew it belonged to Margaret. The birds were meant to be them, she explained, their wings spread in eternal flight, their forms so intertwined that they could never truly be separated. She wanted Margaret to wear it as a reminder that some loves transcend the boundaries of time and space and circumstance, that the heart keeps its own truth regardless of the choices we make or the lies we construct around our secrets. Margaret wore the brooch to her wedding 3 months later, pinned to the lapel of her cream-colored suit while she stood beside Robert in the small Methodist church where she had been baptized. She wore it to her mother's funeral 5 years later, feeling Elena's presence like a whisper in the autumn wind. She wore it to Robert's retirement party, to her own retirement celebration, to countless ordinary days when the silver birds served as her compass, pointing her toward the truth of herself even when she couldn't live that truth openly. Robert never asked about the brooch, though she sometimes caught him looking at it with curiosity. He was a kind man, and their marriage was built on genuine affection and mutual respect. But Margaret always felt like she was living her life at one remove, as if she were watching someone else's story unfold rather than inhabiting her own. She loved Robert in the way that good people love each other, with gratitude and loyalty and deep appreciation for his steadfast presence in her life. But the part of her heart that had awakened in Elena's arms remained forever suspended in that candlelit apartment in San Francisco, preserved like a flower pressed between the pages of a book. Over the years, Margaret constructed a careful mythology around the brooch for anyone who asked. It had been her grandmother's, she would say, or a gift from a dear friend, or something she had bought for herself during her brief time in California. The stories varied, depending on her audience, but the brooch itself remained constant, a daily ritual that connected her to the one great love of her life across the decades and the distance and the silence. She never tried to contact Elena, though she thought about her every day. She told herself it was better this way, that Elena had surely moved on, found someone else to love, built a life that didn't include the ghost of a relationship that had ended before it could truly begin. But sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, Margaret would close her eyes and imagine Elena's voice, the way she used to whisper Margaret's name like a prayer, the way she used to trace patterns on Margaret's skin with her fingertips while they lay tangled together in the aftermath of love. After Robert's death, when Margaret found herself alone in the house they had shared for 35 years, she began to allow herself small freedoms that she had never dared to claim before. She traveled, modestly but meaningfully, visiting cities where she could walk through art galleries and bookstores without encountering anyone who knew her story. She volunteered at the local women's shelter, drawn to work that felt like service rather than obligation. She cultivated friendships with other widows, women who understood the particular loneliness of outliving the people who had defined their lives. But she never spoke of Elena, not even to her closest friends. The love they had shared remained her most precious secret, too sacred to be transformed into anecdote or confession. The brooch was enough, the daily reminder that she had once been loved completely, that she had once loved without reservation, that somewhere in the vast complexity of her life was a chapter written in the language of absolute truth. The lawyer's letter changed everything. Elena had never married. Margaret learned when she called the number provided. She had become a prominent physical therapist in San Francisco, eventually opening her own practice specializing in treatment for elderly patients. She had been active in various charitable organizations, particularly those serving the LGBTQ community, and had lived quietly but openly as a lesbian for the past 3 decades. She had never forgotten Margaret, the lawyer explained gently, and had left specific instructions that Margaret should be contacted upon her death. Elena's final gift to Margaret was a box of letters. Letters that Elena had written to Margaret over the years, but never sent, documenting the evolution of her life, her thoughts, her enduring love for the woman who had married someone else, but never truly left her heart. The letters spanned nearly 4 decades, from the raw grief of Margaret's departure to the mature understanding of a woman who had learned to carry love as a source of strength rather than sorrow. Reading Elena's words, Margaret discovered that their love story had not ended when she left San Francisco, but had continued in parallel, Elena's heart holding space for Margaret, even as Margaret's heart had held space for Elena. Elena wrote about the women she had dated, the relationships she had formed, but always with the understanding that part of her would forever belong to those 18 months when she and Margaret had created their own universe in the margins of an unforgiving world. In the final letter, dated just months before Elena's death, she wrote about the brooch, about how she had imagined Margaret wearing it through all the years of their separation. She had hoped, Elena wrote, that the silver birds would serve as a reminder not of what they had lost, but of what they had found, however briefly. Love like theirs, she wrote, was not diminished by distance or time or circumstance. It existed in its own eternal present, as real and vital as the day it was born. Margaret sat in her kitchen, surrounded by decades of Elena's words, and finally allowed herself to grieve, not just for Elena's death, but for all the years when they might have been together, for all the words they might have spoken, for all the ordinary moments that had been sacrificed to fear and convention and the weight of other people's expectations. She cried for the young woman she had been, so frightened of her own heart that she had chosen safety over love. She cried for Elena, who had lived openly and courageously while Margaret had hidden behind the respectability of heterosexual marriage. She cried for Robert, who had deserved a wife who could love him with her whole heart rather than with the careful affection of someone whose deepest passion was reserved for a memory. When the tears finally stopped, Margaret found herself transformed. The secret she had carried for so long had become not a burden, but a gift, Elena's final offering of permission to claim her truth. She began, tentatively at first, and then with growing confidence, to speak about Elena to the people in her life who mattered most. She told her closest friend, Sarah, about the love that had shaped her more profoundly than any other relationship in her life. She wrote letters to her nieces, hoping that they would understand that love takes many forms and that authenticity is more valuable than approval. Most significantly, she began volunteering at the local PFLAG chapter, offering support to families struggling to understand and accept their LGBTQ children. She spoke at meetings, sharing her story as a cautionary tale about the cost of hiding one's truth and as a celebration of love's ability to endure even in the face of impossible circumstances. She became, in her 70s, the person she had never dared to be in her youth, a woman who refused to apologize for the way her heart had chosen to love. The brooch, meanwhile, took on new meaning. No longer a symbol of secret sorrow, it became a badge of honor, a declaration of love's victory over fear. Margaret wore it to every PFLAG meeting, to every speaking engagement, to every moment when she chose courage over comfort. People began to recognize it as her signature piece, and eventually, some of the braver souls would ask about its significance. Margaret would smile when they asked, touching the silver birds with fingers that no longer trembled. "It was a gift," she would say, "from the love of my life." And in saying those words, she would feel Elena's presence like sunshine on her face, warm and real and eternally present. On the morning of her 74th birthday, Margaret stood before her bathroom mirror and fastened the brooch to her lapel as she had done thousands of times before. But this time, as she looked at her reflection, she saw not a woman burdened by secrets, but a woman who had learned that love, once given and received, becomes immortal. The silver birds caught the morning light, their wings spread in eternal flight, and Margaret whispered the words she had carried in her heart for 37 years. "Thank you, Elena. Thank you for teaching me how to love." The brooch she wore every day had indeed hidden a secret love, but secrets, Margaret had learned, were only prisons when we chose to remain locked inside them. Love, real love, was meant to be shared, celebrated, and honored, not hidden away like something shameful, but proclaimed like the miracle it truly was. And as Margaret walked out into the world that morning, the two silver birds on her chest caught the light like a beacon, telling anyone who cared to look closely that here was a woman who had loved completely, who had been loved in return, and who had finally found the courage to let that love shine.